Gunjan, are we live?
Yep.
Okay, fantastic. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to a very special Startup Operator podcast. We're live with Hari TN. Just a second. I think I can hear my voice at your end, Gunjan. You might have to mute the audio. All right, just give me a second. Okay, I think we're good. Sorry about that. So, welcome again. Thank you so much for joining us. We're live with Hari TN, who is an author, mentor, investor, and the head of HR at Big Basket. Big Basket, all of you know, is India's largest online food and grocery store. It was recently acquired by the Tata Group. We'll be speaking to him about his new book, co-authored with his friend, entrepreneur, and investor Sanjay Swamy. The book is called Sailing Through a Storm, Making a Crisis Work for You. It's an inspiring read and lends useful perspective on coming out of this crisis stronger. So, welcome to the podcast, sir. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Roshan.
Yeah. So, for those of you who are listening, we did a podcast in May about building and scaling a people function with Hari, sir. You should definitely check it out. Uh, so, one of the things that I think I mentioned to you earlier before we started streaming was a lot of the fear originates from the ambiguity that is there about any crisis, and the book dispels uh, the myth about that ambiguity, right? That it reinforces that, I mean, we have seen crises earlier, right? So how did you how did you start writing this book? What made you write this book?
This was possibly the first time I think the whole world is facing a crisis of some kind or the other. I think from time to time, the world has faced a crisis. 2000, for example, you had the dot-com bust. 2008, we had the credit crisis. But I think both these crises spared, some individuals, some groups of people. But the pandemic of 2020, I don't think spared anyone. So I think everyone was seeing some crisis or the other. All of us were locked down at home. We were living through a historic period. We are continue to live through a historic period. So at that point of time, I think early during the lockdown, I realized that it is important to be able to capture some of the learnings of how to deal with a crisis fairly quickly. And I realized that, while most of us, the world is facing a crisis this time, crisis is not new to many of us. From time to time, individuals have faced crises that have been far worse than the pandemic. Groups of companies and individual companies have faced crises that are far worse than the pandemic. And therefore, dealing with a crisis is not new to people, but I think it is new to a large number of people. So I thought, it'll be helpful to figure out, are there any lessons that are common to dealing with a crisis? And then if we could put out some kind of a book, some kind of a, placeholder where all of these lessons could be, placed together, we thought it would help people deal with this.
Right. So one of the things again is that you talk about these three crises, right? I mean, 92, 2008, and then the current one. And we always feel that, whatever problem we're dealing with at the moment is always unique in some respects.
Yes.
But there are certain common elements, as you mentioned. There is the same sort of fear, uncertainty, doubt. There is hope, there is despair, and all of those things. Uh, can you compare and contrast this particular crisis with the earlier two crises that you faced?
Yeah, so I think just quickly as a background, I think the way we've written this book is we've talked of three kinds of stories because we realize that, stories are a very powerful medium for communicating lessons. The first category of stories were drawn from our personal experiences. The second category of stories we've taken from history. We've gone back to as far as, the 15th century, we've taken stories from the 18th century, and we've taken stories from contemporary history as well. The third category of stories are related to companies and corporates. And companies and corporates are, the things that most people can easily relate to, at least those who are living in the present day world can relate to. So we've taken these three categories of stories to communicate lessons. Coming back to your very specific question of how this crisis is different from the previous ones, I think it's very different because this is a medical crisis that has snowballed into an economic and financial crisis, which means that it started off as a medical crisis, has huge medical implications, but therefore also has economic implications. But the past crises were largely economic and financial. And the playbook for dealing with economic and financial crisis has already been written. So, for example, central banks know exactly what to do when there is a crisis like what happened in 2008 or what happened in 2000, what happened in 1992. So central banks clearly know how to stimulate demand, what kind of policies, to quickly roll out. So the playbook has been written, the answers are pretty much there, and in some ways it's relatively easy to deal with that. But this is something that we are all grappling with for the first time. The last medical crisis, possibly in a large scale, humanity faced was about 100 years back when the Spanish flu struck and actually decimated millions of people across the globe, including India. And last 100 years, there have been epidemics, but nothing of this scale. There have been fears of pandemic, but this is the real one. And we have no idea whether a vaccine is going to work, not work. Even after taking the vaccine, how long will the immunity last? We don't know. We don't know whether we can ever get back, into assembling into large groups, for example, to watch a movie in a movie hall. Can we ever have a physical event where 1,000 people turn up at a conference and very closely interact? Will we ever be able to have that? How long before we can do something like that? None of us really know. So I think there are a lot of uncertainties. Even as we are talking at this point of time, people have discovered that there's a new strain of COVID-19, which has been discovered in the UK and in India, Bangalore particularly. I think people who have the strain are being tracked out by the government, and you need to isolate them. So we don't know if you discover a vaccine for COVID-19 whether the virus can mutate and take on a different strain, and will this vaccine still be effective? So there's so many doubts, uncertainties. I think we have never dealt with something like this before, and we have never experienced lockdowns. We never had to stay at home. So in the past crisis, some of the people lost their jobs, some companies lost businesses, had to shut. But it was never that, the whole of humanity had to be locked down at homes and deal with the kind of things that we are dealing with now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so this is one of the things that I was joking with, friend of mine as well, who, so I graduated in 2008, and in about 3 months of my graduating, Lehman Brothers crashed, and the rest is history, right? I mean, you had the whole, and to make matters worse, I was selling recruitment services when companies were downsizing. Uh,
Correct.
so that was an interesting call to make to HRs at that point of time and say, hey, now's the best time to hire talent, right? So uh, and yes, the definite difference that we saw was, I mean, at that point of time, at least you could still meet people, and this is something very new that people have dealt with. um, to one of the things we kept hearing throughout the year is this phrase that became little annoying towards the end, which is the new normal. And you reference that in your book as well, right? So is there such a thing as a new normal, or do you think, I mean, is it's just again one of those you know sort of an availability bias or whatever you call it, right? I mean, is what do you make of this new normal?
Sometimes I think phrases catch the imagination of the public at large and they tend to get overused. But having said that, I think many of these phrases, if you see carefully, do serve a purpose, do address a particular situation well. So, for example, after the 1973, war between Israel and the Arab nations, especially Egypt, OPEC was formed and they imposed an oil embargo on Western countries, and price of oil jumped 400%. Production was cut down by 25-30%. So that changed the world completely in terms of the way people looked at this non-renewable resource called petrol or oil. And suddenly, for a change, cars which were far more efficient got designed. Japan emerged as the biggest car producer and exporter in the world. They began designing fuel efficient cars. Suddenly fuel efficient cars were cool. In the US, gas guzzlers, huge cars had become the fashion pre-oil crisis. And the world changed after that. France went down the path of nuclear energy, and today almost 75% of France's energy is from nuclear sources. Suddenly, the world began discovering the merits of other renewable energy sources like solar and wind. And today they are contributing to a very significant part of total energy consumption of mankind. And these are less polluting. They don't generate greenhouse gases, as a result of which we will also solve the problem of global warming. So I think 1973 changed the way the world looked at some of these things. And that's clearly a new normal. So a new normal is when you accept a new paradigm. So while it's abused, I think accepting and realizing that the new paradigm has come in place is really a new normal. So today, for example, a new normal is recognition of the fact that you don't need to travel or commute for 4 hours, 2 hours in bad traffic just so that you could assemble under one roof and work together. I don't think that's necessary. So that recognition is a new normal. The fact that you can have Zoom meetings which are very effective, that you can be very effective working virtual, working remote, I think is pretty much a new normal. To my mind, a lot of unnecessary travel will go away. People found themselves traveling in the past, taking a plane at the drop of a hat, traveling across the world, crisscrossing the country, crisscrossing the globe, and thought that they were very smart, very cool, and were very, very corporate types. But I think the realization that you don't need to do all that shit uh, has dawned upon us. So that's a new normal. So I think new normals have a place. Having said that, it's also very common to say that the storm is common, but the boats are all different. That's also true in some case, because all of us see a particular crisis from our own vantage points, and therefore we see things very differently. So, for example, in 1973, when this oil crisis happened, many people, saw an opportunity, because the Arab nations were afraid that America would freeze their dollar assets, and therefore a lot of offshore, banking companies got set up in countries such as, the Cayman Islands, British Virgin Islands. Many of these tax havens, Mauritius, got set up so that Arab countries could then channelize their American deposits through these sources. So many countries saw an opportunity, open up. So I think a new normal is, companies like Zoom saw their stock jump up multifold, because suddenly being able to have effective meetings online was the need of the hour. So while it was a crisis for most people, it was a huge tailwind for the company like Zoom, and even all online e-commerce companies in India and maybe the rest of the world saw this as a tailwind because it was all positive for them. Non-contact online commerce became a rage. People began migrating from physical stores to online stores. So I would say, we're all in different boats.
Yep. And particularly if we talk about turning the crisis into an opportunity. So the Big Basket story has been a sort of a case study of how to manage this crisis and turn it into an opportunity over the course of this year. Can you talk us through what really happened? Because we hear this information in bits and pieces. We understood that early on when the lockdowns were declared and so on, some of the workers had migrated, but at the same time your demand shot up, and in order to keep pace with that, there were a bunch of things that you had to do. So for those of us who are listening and curious about how you manage the whole Big Basket people operations as such, could you help us understand that?
Yeah. So frankly, Roshan, I think we should, Big Basket should not, nor would I take the credit for having done an outstanding job for the simple reason that we were very lucky. In the sense that while the crisis decimated a large number of industries. For example, physical retail was decimated. A company like Future Retail almost got bankrupt and had to sell off to Reliance. And airlines faced trouble. So many companies were decimated. We were just lucky that we were in the online business, and people wanted to suddenly shop online because they did not want to avoid they wanted to avoid physical stores. So we were very lucky. So we were solving a good problem, in the sense that there was an opportunity, demand was skyrocketing. For us, it was about how do we address this increase in demand. And obviously, there were some challenges along the way. It was not very easy, but relatively, I would say it's the kind of challenge that we had was far less than the challenge that a company like a Make My Trip had, for example. Make My Trip had to deal with far bigger challenges because traffic completely dropped. And they had to innovate, think out of the box. For us, it was not thinking out of the box. It was just how do you recruit frontline staff and do it quickly. And the good thing is that, or bad thing is that, India is a poor nation. And most people, you and I are lucky to have good jobs, well paying jobs, where we can take home good money. And even if we are out of a job for 6 months, our savings are going to support us. But that's not the case with most Indians. Most Indians don't have savings to support them if they lose their job. They're living hand to mouth. They just have maybe a month of savings to support them. So many people in India want to come back to jobs quickly and take the risk, even if it is risky. And therefore, we found it relatively easy to hire people. So while a good number of people migrated back to their hometowns because they lost their jobs in whichever city they were in, they went back to their hometowns in states like Uttarakhand, Uttar Pradesh, Bengal, Bihar, Jharkhand. Millions of people, workers returned. And their story is pretty tragic. I'm sure all of us know what we saw on television about the crisis that all of them faced. Many of them did not even have trains and buses to go back home. They had to trek back, walk back 1,000 miles in hot sun. So we all know their stories. But a lot of locals who were unemployed wanted jobs. And therefore, we began hiring from those sources. And therefore, we were able to get the number of people required. It wasn't easy, but we were helped by the fact that India is an employment hungry nation. Bunch of people who don't have savings, who need to work to put food on the table for their family. So I would say it's not the credit of Big Basket as such, it's just the state of affairs in India that made it so easy for people to come back to work.
Right, right. Yeah, I would say that's fair. And, one of the things that we've seen is the crisis has affected various sections of the society in a very uneven form, right? I mean, it's all well for, white collar workers to sort of say that, hey, our lives have become, I would say, a lot simpler now. We can work out of
Yeah.
our offices. But yeah, I mean, it's not the case with all cross sections of the society. Uh, so let's go back to 89, 90. Right, you know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about when you were with Tata Steel, right? And you had this whole liberalization happen at around that time, and then all the Southeast Asian countries start dumping steel, selling it at way below whatever is the market price at that point of time, and then you are forced to right size, right? Which is basically cut down your workforce, and also some of your let's say more people friendly policies, I would say, which are like you get a job for life, and then your children also can get a job, so on and so forth. These kind of things that the Tata culture sort of nurtured, you had to do a revamp or rejig of all of that. Can you take us through that? I know you've spoken about it
Yeah.
in our May podcast as well, but I think it's particularly relevant when we're talking about the crisis. So could you take us through that time and what really happened?
Yes. So it's interesting, nobody is in business for purely altruistic reasons. Though
Yeah.
from time to time we hear, people say that the Tatas are very altruistic. But I think J.N. Tata himself said that we are not more altruistic than anybody else or the others. We are just smart about the way we do business. And we realize that long term, what is good for the business may appear to others as altruism. whereas what we really are doing are the smart things for the long term. So Tata's had for a long time, pre this crisis, had come up with an approach where lifelong employment, guaranteed lifelong employment, and employment for children, and supporting the communities around them was a smart business decision, because Tatas were operating in Jharkhand, right? Southern part of Bihar those days, and now Jharkhand, very, very backward, extremely backward. And they went to those mineral rich areas, put up a factory where people did not have the basics of life. They did not have 2 square meals a day. So in such an environment, you can't afford to be seen as making a lot of money and being wealthy without supporting the communities around you. If you do that, there will be a revolution. There'll be blood flow. So the startups were smart enough to realize that it's important to support those communities, make them self-sufficient, give them jobs in the factory, guarantee them employment if they worked honestly and sincerely, and give the children also priority in employment. So very smart business policies. But 1991 changed all that, because CIS countries, as I mentioned, post-liberalization, were dumping steel at prices that were below our costs, which was dramatic. And therefore, the Tatas realized that either you shut down the company, which means that nobody has a job, or you right size the company, cut down your costs, and become sustainable, as a result of which a good number of people will still maintain the jobs, but some people will have to pay the price for this. So that's the reality. You know the story of Bhagavad Gita, right? Arjuna was faced with a moral dilemma on the battlefield, whether to fight his own relations or not. And Krishna tells him that this is a moral dilemma you need to deal with, which is you need to balance emotion and reason. While you're deeply emotional and attached to all your relatives, it's also important to be on the right side of things, which is that you need to yourself survive and do the things which are in your own self-interest, self-preservation. So the same, moral dilemma the Tatas faced. In life, all of us face these moral dilemmas, and therefore important to separate reason and emotion. And in fact, one of the chapters in the book is how do you separate reason and emotion? That is really the Bhagavad Gita. The second chapter is
Yeah.
in corporate stories. We have brought out the essence of the Gita in that chapter. So I think that's what the Tatas did, which is they said, what, no more lifelong employment. And they brought in J.J. Irani, who was a different kind of a leader, who was very cut and dry, who was ruthless, who was brutal. At the same time, he had grown up in the Tata way of life, and therefore he had that gentleness and humane touch as well. So he changed the narrative from lifelong employment to employment as long as you are performing, employment based on merit, progression in your career based on merit. And he communicated these messages, whether it was inaugurating a blast furnace inside the steel works or inaugurating a maternity ward at the Tata main hospital. At every single forum, he just kept hammering home this same message. So very quickly, the paradigm changed. People accepted that, this world is no longer the same as it used to be. We have to all accept it. Otherwise, we are going to perish. The unions accepted it. So I think that was just the amazing part, which is that he realized that it's important to beat that message every day in every forum. Only then will you be able to change the attitude of people who were rooted in a different paradigm altogether.
Right. So one of the chapters that Sanjay talks about, as well as, he talks about messaging precisely, right? So he talks about meeting this elderly gentleman on a flight. He calls him Sam, and says that, they're talking about the Gulf War, and the person says that, it doesn't matter who starts the war, but it matters who finishes it, or who fires the last bullet as such. And he segues into how messaging and narrative building is important. um, can you talk us through, how you can use messaging positively to sort of, I won't say subvert the crisis, I'll say, like, soften the blow a little bit, and at the same time inspire people to do their best and so on.
Yeah. So I think crisis management to a large extent is about inspirational leadership. One of the components of inspirational leadership is to show people hope. Somebody had said the only role, I think it was Napoleon, the only role of a leader is a purveyor of hope, someone who sells hope. That's the sole role of a leader. And this becomes far more important in times of a crisis where everybody feels that everything is lost. I am dead, my job is gone, my everything is gone, the world is broken around me. How do you then communicate hope to these people, to those people who are affected? That's one of the most important role of a leader. And I think messaging is therefore very critical. So for example, in Johnson and Johnson faced a big crisis when one of the biggest well-known products was Tylenol, which was an over-the-counter drug, which was for body aches, headaches, and all of that, and it's a very popular drug. And somebody had gone to a few departmental stores in the Chicago area, picked a few bottles, replaced the medicine with cyanide in the capsules, and placed the bottles back on the shelves. So a few people died as a result of taking those capsules, buying and using those. And quickly it was discovered that the deaths were because of the Tylenol capsules. It was a huge crisis. Now, how do you manage the messaging is very critical, because the world does not care whether you were responsible for a crisis or not.
Yeah.
Even if you are not responsible for a crisis, but if you handle it badly, they will almost hold you responsible for the crisis. So irrespective of whether you are the cause of the crisis or not, how you handle it post the crisis erupting is really going to determine whether how sympathetic people are going to be for you. Therefore, it's important to control the narrative, to control the messaging. And in all these cases, it's very important, therefore, to be honest, to be transparent, to be upfront, to not be in a denial mode, not to get defensive, not to blame others. So these are all very, simple principles. And therefore, the principle of be honest is always going to work. The moment if you say things which show that you are defensive, then they come back to you very hard. People come back very hard at you. So it's important to be very transparent, saying that, yes, I think some things have happened. We are completely investigating. We are cooperating with authorities, and be very, very open about this. Sometimes if you shut yourself and, you think, I don't know what to say, how to say it, saying something might be cause more damage, then it could cause you trouble, because the media does not care whether you participate in a story or not. The media will go ahead with the story even if you don't participate. And therefore, they will go ahead with their version of the story. So it's important for you to participate in whichever way you want. If you can't say a few things, don't say a few things. But say it that you can't say this at this point of time, because you still don't know yourself. So just very honestly participate in the conversation. So that's very important. So I think, the narrative and messaging is extremely important. Even in case of job losses, the way you message it is very critical. It will determine how people, take the messaging. So for example, if there are 100 people and you're laying off 10 people, you want the remaining 90 to be very positive, right? You don't want the remaining 90 to be demotivated and to be angry with the company. So the way you message the departure of these 10 people, not only with those 10 people, but the remaining 90 people, will determine whether those 90 people are going to be loyal to you, are going to work for you with a lot of enthusiasm, are going to feel inspired, motivated, or are they going to feel upset with you? So messaging is very critical. It's make or break.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in these situations, people tend to value sincerity over anything else. And one of the things that I happen to read in this book called Alchemy by Rory Sutherland is he talks about this strange dichotomy of customers having faced a service issue which is resolved successfully, having a higher NPS and higher satisfaction scores than someone who did not have any issue, right?
Correct. Very true.
So yeah, so that is definitely something interesting. What are some other leadership traits that you see in during the crisis? Because oftentimes we hear that there is a wartime CEO
Yeah.
and then there's a peacetime CEO, right?
Right. Right.
So what is a classic traits of a wartime CEO?
See, I think a wartime CEO, I don't know wartime or peacetime, but let me just say good leadership traits for a crisis. So I think first one is really about the difference between knowing and doing. So a lot of people understand something, but very few people are able to do something based on that. So that's the difference between knowing and doing. It's also the difference between intellect and character. Intellect is in being able to understand patterns, spot patterns. Intellect is in being able to understand interconnections well. but character is in being able to do something about it. So, for example, if you believe that integrity is important, you could do two things. One is you could lead a life of high integrity. That is because you know it, integrity is important, you're leading a life of high integrity. But if you're a leader, you are demonstrating character if you convince 1,000 other people that leading a life of integrity is important. And if you can convince your company that integrity should be a value that we all live by, then you're demonstrating character. So character requires courage because it requires you to go out and convince those 1,000 people that integrity is important. Character, for example, I'll take a real life example. So, for example, in during the 2008 crisis, everyone knew that there was a housing bubble. Many people actually knew that there was a housing bubble that had built up and that the valuations were pretty much unsustainable. But there was one hedge fund manager called John Paulson who took a bet against the housing market based on that knowledge. He bet his farm and house on it. He bet $1 billion and actually made a profit of almost $12 billion. And the challenge is that he could have lost all the $1 billion because the markets can remain irrational for longer than you can remain solvent, as Keynes had said. So therefore, he could have lost all that $1 billion. But he realized that let me take this bet because I'm sure that the housing market is overvalued. It's a matter of time before it collapses. And I am hoping to make that money before it collapses. And markets eventually collapse, and that's how he made his money. That's the difference between character and intellect. Raghuram Rajan knew, many others knew that the bubble was there, but none of them did anything about it, excepting someone like John Paulson. Similarly, Warren Buffett, knew that and he acted on it. So, you had Lehman Brothers collapsing, as you said. It was a historic collapse. Nobody ever believed $640 billion in assets collapsed. And nobody at that point of time wanted to touch an iBank. But Warren Buffett came in and invested $5 billion in Goldman Sachs. And he invested it when the Goldman Sachs was falling. It had fallen to less than half the price, pre-crisis. So he invested $5 billion in a falling market. That is character. And he made a huge amount of money. He made a huge fortune by this smart investment. So the first leadership trait, I think, is the difference between knowing and doing, which I call intellect and character. The second one I would say is, leadership that trait that brings in a combination of feminine and masculine leadership traits. A lot of the crisis, you think about it hard. Historically, any crisis in this world, whether it was a war, whether it was a financial crisis, whether it was a pandemic, think very carefully and you will find that the cause of a crisis was unbridled masculine ambition, masculine greed, and masculine need for power, nothing else. Just think about it carefully. These are the three things which have caused any single crisis. And therefore, I think it's important to bring in an element of feminine leadership traits, which is about caring, which is about collaboration, compassion. These are very important leadership traits. I think in corporate world, many of these traits, female traits, feminine traits are missing. And therefore, you end up in these cyclical crises from time to time. You need to bring, so great leaders are able to bring a combination of the two. And in all difficult situations, they unleash this blend. I talked of Akbar, the Great, in the book, where the difference between him and Aurangzeb are stark. Akbar was illiterate. Many other great kings of medieval India were illiterate. Shivaji was illiterate. Krishnadevaraya was illiterate, but some of the greatest emperors in India. Aurangzeb, on the other hand, was very literate, very educated, but he never knew the values of feminine, leadership traits. As a result of which, there was a crisis throughout his life. He could never, ever lead a peaceful, there was no peace in his empire at all. Whereas Akbar created peace throughout his empire. Even when he conquered territories, he assimilated, those people into his empire. He even got into, marriage alliance. Jahangir, who was his son, was actually the son of Jodhabai, who was a Hindu wife of Akbar. And Jodhabai was his first queen. So I think we drew the difference between Akbar and Aurangzeb. Similarly, Ahilyabai Holkar brought that feminine and masculine leadership traits. A woman can bring both a feminine and masculine set traits. A man can also bring the combination of masculine and feminine traits. This is the second one. There are many others I can talk of. It's important. to have a sense of purpose and meaning in your life. And I think most of us can go through the whole life without a sense of meaning and purpose, because in good times it's not easy to discover meaning and purpose. It's only when you go through a life death situation, when you go through a problem that you cannot solve, that you cannot escape from, you go through real adversity that God has given you, which you cannot escape from, that's when you learn some kind of purpose and meaning in your life. And once you learn that purpose and meaning, it gives you that inner strength. So I think people who are good leaders in a crisis have that inner strength in them. And a crisis is the best time to develop that inner strength. So these are some of the other traits I can talk about. Important to be fearless and selfless. Many of us tend to be selfish, and it comes in different ways. I think the real achievement of leadership is about when you can be truly selfless, when you care about the communities around you, the people around you, the company around you, the teams around you, and don't keep your interests in mind, keep everybody else's interests in mind. That's another way of demonstrating great leadership. I think these are some of the lessons and which we figured out were helpful in a crisis.
Right. Yeah, I was really happy to read about The Big Short in your book. I mean, I think it's a fantastic movie that sort of characterizes all these people who had that
Yeah.
heterodox thinking at that point of time. I want to pick up on something that you mentioned, which is being proactive in this whole crisis, right? I mean, saying that, hey, I mean, so you actually talk about acceptance versus actually, some sort of a getting away from this feeling, right? I'm not sure if I'm describing it
Yeah.
perfectly, but the contrast between accepting your circumstance versus, doing something about it, essentially. Now, this doing something about it requires you to be proactive, requires you to actually imagine something which is better and then move towards it actively, right? Um, how can more people, who may not necessarily be in leadership roles per se, let's say at companies or whatever, but take charge of their life and sort of, lead with intent?
So I think acceptance is the first step towards really got to do with a crisis, or it's got nothing to do with leadership. I think it applies to each one of us. So I think, there's something called self-awareness. I think it was Samuel Johnson, the famous British, writer, sometime had said something like, the funniest part, absurd conduct that all of us demonstrate from time to time is because we want to imitate somebody who we cannot resemble. So self-awareness is accepting ourselves for who we are, which is that if we have a certain set of weaknesses, it's important to acknowledge and accept those weaknesses. So people who demonstrate good self-awareness are largely those who understand themselves well and who have accepted themselves for who they are. They love themselves for who they are. If they are not good at problem solving, they accept I'm not good at problem solving. If they're not good at building relationships with people, they accept that I'm not good at building relationships with people. If you don't accept it, then you will do absurd things and you will never be able to solve a problem. So at the starting point is acceptance. So I think if you accept something, then you are able to figure out what are the ways, in which you can solve it. And this applies for individuals, as I said, even if there's no crisis, it applies to individuals if there's a crisis, and it applies to companies also. So I think, let's say if you are an individual, I talked of if you accept yourself for who you are, then you are able to get along with the world better. The world will love you, because if you are saying, I don't understand, for example, solving problems well, can I get some help? The world will love you for it. And similarly, if you are also accepting, for example, if you lost a job, one thing is that you can keep on feeling bad that the company fired you. You can keep a grouse against the company. You can be upset, angry with the company or your boss. But if you accept it, that yes, the reality is that under the current circumstances, my skills are not valued by my company, and hence I have been fired, or I have been overpaid and the company does not need me, and therefore I've been fired. For whatever reason, I have been fired. So if you accept it, then you will figure out what is the way of solving that. So for example, if you accept that I have been overpaid for my job, I know, many of us actually are overpaid because we sometimes switch from one job to the other based on demand supply. And sometimes companies are desperate to hire and we get very high salaries. And many times we get salaries which we do not deserve based on our skills, and many more competent people are less paid. But sometimes that company figures out in bad times that we are overpaid, so they will fire us. So if we accept that, then we'll figure out, how to deal with life going forward. What are the new skills I should develop? How should I negotiate my salary differently going forward? What behavioral changes I should demonstrate going forward? Some of those lessons you will learn. So I think acceptance is the first step. And then if you can accept it well, then I think you have the potential to do something about it.
Right. Yeah, one of my favorite parts in the book is where you talk about Pushpalata, right, who is a sex worker, and then she joins an NGO and she makes, she reforms plenty of things, right? So, yeah, and how she's born into adversity, but makes the best out of it and strives to achieve better. Uh, so, typically when we are talking about being better and managing this crisis and everything, there's a one can't help but associate a professional sort of a motive to all of this, right? We want to be better at work and so on and so forth. But then, of course, there is an entire personal life which we often ignore. And this year, I think there's been it's safe to say that everyone has had some sort of a psychological stress, whether it's back-to-back calls or having to balance their family versus the work in very very close quarters. How do you sort of reconcile with that, managing your personal life as well as you are trying to get better at work?
So, if I understood your question correctly, I think the last couple of sentences were, how do you manage your personal life also as
Yeah,
you're
in a
getting
crisis.
better
Yeah.
in a crisis?
Yeah.
So, I think, a crisis can affect your personal life, a crisis can affect your work life. And sometimes by affecting your work life, it has also affected your personal life, because if you lose your job, then your personal life also has been impacted in a big way. So I think the two are in many ways interrelated. So I think there are many ways in which you should manage your personal life. One is, of course, as I told you, acceptance is the first step towards finding an answer. And I think another way of dealing with a personal thing is like people like Pushpalata, for example, right? So they realize that she's a sex worker, and the fact I can continue to remain what I am, or the fact that, I can do something that can help the lives of the 15,000 other sex workers in Bangalore. So I think deep desire to do something is also an important component of managing your personal life. The other thing is that there are two ways in which you can approach life. One is things are not in my control at all. There's nothing in my control. Everything has affected me, and I'm a victim. The other thing way of approaching life is I'm not a victim. I have things which are in my control, and I will do whatever I can do in my control. There's a very famous prayer which I had heard in childhood, which is something like, I don't remember exactly, God, give me the courage to change the things I can, the equanimity to accept the things I cannot change, and the wisdom to know the difference. So I think if you really realize that whatever you can change, you should try and change those. And I think good people, smart people, resilient people are those who believe that their circle of influence is quite big, which means that they will not blame others, but they will see what is it that I can do to change my life. Take a real example. Suddenly after the lockdown, I heard some people complaining that, there is no difference now between work and home, because work has crept into my home. People call me any time of the day or night. And, I end up working, in the past, I used to come home from office. I used to forget everything about the office once I'm at home. But now everything, the office occupies my mind 24/7. These are people who had not even lost their jobs, and they were complaining about such silly things. Imagine those millions of people who lost their jobs, could not have money to feed their families, the migrant workers walking back 1,000 kilometers, 1,000 miles in the hot sun. Compare their lives with your life, and you are complaining. Shame on you that you're complaining about these kind of things. You can so easily fix these things, no? If people are calling you during lunchtime, you can just block that time between 1 to 2 as lunch, and say nobody should call you. Just set expectations with your stakeholders, with your team, with your manager, everybody, and tell them between 9 to 12 or 8 to 10, I'm going to be busy with my household work. So don't ever call me, block that on your calendar. So it's so easy to do it. Instead, you are complaining. So the way to solve some of these things in life, not just this, is that you have to take charge of your life. You can't keep complaining that the world, has changed some things for you. You can always find this, attitude in some people who will always keep complaining. You know what? Things are no longer, every event, every scenario is used as a source of complaining that, things are not happening like this. It used to be like this. Life was better in the office. I used to, I didn't. But now remember, you're not commuting 2 hours every day, 10 hours of time you're saving. So when people go to office, they will complain about traffic. When people are sitting at home, they will complain about not going through traffic. So that's an attitude, I think. So you need to realize that things are in your control, and whatever is in your control, you fix it. And whatever is not truly in your control, be very cool about it. Take it philosophically.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that certainly helps. I mean, taking control of your calendar, how you choose to spend your time and energy, and being proactive on that front. Yeah, that certainly helps. Okay, we're nearing the end of the podcast. Last couple of questions left. What do you hope that the book will achieve? What do you want the readers to take away from the book, and what do you hope it'll achieve?
I really don't know, Roshan, whether a book will change anything permanently. I think a book can inspire someone temporarily, at least. So I think there are many people who already understand what is written in the book. They don't need inspiration because they are already a source of inspiration for other people. But for some people who, from time to time, may want a little bit of inspiration by listening to the stories of people and looking for some practical tips, practical insights, we have provided some of those practical tips, learnings from history, so that from time to time, when they face questions like these, then they are able to resolve. For example, moral dilemma is something that we have all faced at some point of time or the other. And the answer is all there. 2000, 3000, 1500, I don't know when Bhagavad Gita was written. The answer for that was provided, how to deal with the moral dilemma. But from time to time, we forget it because we don't necessarily read every document. So this book will again remind people that there's something called managing your being rational on the one hand and being emotional. So it reinforces some of those very old lessons, masculine and feminine leadership traits, a blend. Who said it's new? Of course, it's not new at all. We are saying nothing new in this book. We are saying things which have been told many times, in the past, in history. We're just bringing them all together, a few things together, so that it inspires a few individuals. That's all.
Right. So you mentioned, I mean, people have inspired you. Who has inspired you this year? I mean, who have you learned particularly from this year, and any stories from this year that you take as inspiration?
I feel inspired by many people, Roshan. In fact, one of the things that I enjoy doing the most is talking to interesting people. And I think what this pandemic has allowed me is to talk to interesting people, because pre-pandemic, I believed, and many people believe, that the only way for you to exchange views is to physically meet the other person. Now, and therefore that limited the number of people you could meet. But this time, I think in the last 9 months, I have met many interesting people, met many amazing people, and heard a lot of wonderful stories, inspirational stories. And there, I can't even count the number of people I have. So, for example, recently I was approached by Samina Bano. She is a young lady from Uttar Pradesh, lives in Lucknow, and she had all the difficulties in life. Born into a Muslim family, education not very easy. She would have got married very early, but she studied very hard. She did studied at IIM Bangalore, worked for Deloitte, lived in the US, came back to India, and is now given up all the cushy things of life and solving the problem of poor children's education. So she's fighting for the right to education, RTE. She's fighting the education mafia. It's not easy to fight the education mafia, or any mafia for that matter. Right? Her life is under threat. And she felt inspired by this book, and she wanted to interview me. So such a nice thing. I met somebody from who's living in Estonia, a lady who lives in Estonia. I saw her posts, and by today the internet allows you to understand people just by reading what they are writing. So I met her on the net, we spoke, we exchanged, she became an enduring friend. So I met a lot of people who are very, very inspiring. This
Right.
pandemic allowed me to meet them.
Fantastic. So that's a great note to end the podcast on, sir. Thank you so much for writing this book. Certainly a wonderful book and very inspiring book as well. For those of you listening, do check out this book. It's really fascinating. And also it's a very short read, 1 or 2 sittings. I think you can finish this. A lot of very good lessons in there and stories as well. Um, as I think we have discussed, as much as this crisis is unique, I mean, there are certain things that you can definitely learn from history. And that is something that, comes to bear when you read this book. So thank you so much, sir. Any final comments?
No, nothing. Thank you for having me, Roshan. It was fun.
Right. Thank you so much, sir. All right. Thank
Thanks.
you, everyone.
Bye. Take care.
Bye.